Gee, hello, and welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk Development. My name is Umair Javed. I'm an associate professor of sociology and development here at the Gurmani School at LUMS. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Muhammad Ali, who is a development anthropologist with over 2 decades of experience working on socioeconomic and political challenges with a range of stakeholders, including multilateral and bilateral donors, think tanks, government agencies, NGOs, and community based organizations. He has taught anthropology, international development, and South Asia specific courses at universities in Australia, Pakistan, and the United States. Currently, he lectures at Johns Hopkins University and is affiliated with BNU here in Lahore, and has been writing a weekly column for Express Tribune for quite some time. He also provides expert testimony in UK and US immigration courts for asylum seekers. Thank you once again for joining us. The topic. The broad theme of our discussion today will be how aid is drying up. So foreign aid is drying up and how that's impacting developing countries like Pakistan. And more broadly, we want to sort of speak a little more about the entire architecture of global development, specifically and how it ties to the structure of capitalism, colloquially defined as neoliberal capitalism, over the past few decades. So I'll just start off with picking up this notion of how aid seems to have dried up. So in your view, are we seeing is this a temporary fiscal shock, or do you think this marks a structural rupture in how international aid actually functions?
Probably so far, structural rupture, the way things are going. And there's been all this discussion about carrots and sticks. So if we look at the largest bilateral donor being the US, there's been a long recognition. And I think this recognition even goes back to the colonial context, the need to subsidize, in some form, shape or the other, and aid being that kind of sweetener, has existed for a while. And it's had problems through and through. But basically, this recognition and this debate in countries like the US that essentially foreign policy choices are a carrot or a stick. And often, for the sake of empire, you need to yield both. But having aid, is a more an easier tool to pursue your own national interests. And that is perhaps the most realpolitik read, of this. Because it's not to say that there isn't altruism and there isn't a real need that is then eventually addressed through what little aid reaches people in need. But this premise has, for a variety of reasons, the movement to the far right, the movement of the left to the center, thinking that they'll be able to bring some of the more conservative right people on the right into their folds, and the right then moved far right. And that has, led to discussions of, America first and, defending Europe's borders. So not only sort of xenophobia, but also this decision to withdraw from the rest of the world. So the US has, cut down, it's basically disbanded US aid and folded its remnants into the State Department, which the Republicans had wanted to do for decades, by the way. And in Europe, there's been increasing pressure on defense, and already there was alignment, for not only Europe, but also Australia with trade.
Right.
So aid and trade going hand in hand. And now there's increasing stress on that as NATO has to defend itself.
Right. So, you've very helpfully you've identified a number of these political and economic factors that are, in some ways, these are particular to those societies. So donor societies or societies where sort of aid money was originating from, and I guess the broader question then sort of one has to ask is, when we look back onto these past 2 or 3 decades when aid was relatively plentiful, do you think if you were to give an assessment, was it actually sort of useful in any way, or do you think it largely catered to the interests of the donors themselves, or do you think both of these two things can actually be true at the same time?
Well, they can to a certain degree be true at the same time. And I mean, if I think back to all the project evaluations I've done, I mean, for the bigger projects and then also for humanitarian NGOs, etc. When I used to be based here, I mean, I can't say that I didn't see any benefits. I mean, I saw on the ground. I mean, and here one's not talking only about hard infrastructure and the brick and mortar, because there's only so much you can do with that.
Right.
And there's also thinking that needs to go into that. I mean, the sort of the ecological costs. I mean, the concept of tide aid. Where is that infrastructure? Where's the technical expertise? What kind of design features does that architecture have? Is it environmentally friendly? Is it tapping into local resources? Because often when aid comes, I mean, another string attached with aid has been this idea of tide aid.
Right.
That you don't only take the money, but you also take that money and do with it what we suggest you do. And a lot of those suggestions are coming from our people.
Right.
So, a lot of that money and US aid has also been doing a lot of that, where it has, issued guidance down to the level of what airline you can use and, what kind of partnership it has with, American Airlines for you to travel on a state department funded project, for instance. So, I mean, I think some of those issues have been there, but on the ground, both things have happened. I mean, I've seen elite capture, and here I'm not thinking of, the 20 or 30 families. I mean, here I'm thinking of a local Bansabdar or a Chaudhry who perhaps doesn't even have an entire set of teeth.
Right.
But he is determining where a particular community pond is going, where the school should be located. And some of that has to then go back to these ideas of user charges, right? Of making aid more financially sustainable. So using these market-based imperatives, which then in turn enable elite capture as well. So that again has to do with design. So I think that, it's easier to finger point, but I think then I mean, if we're doing so, then we can't exonerate either side. A lot of this has to do with broader design, how it passes through how ODA, official development aid, passes through the bureaucracy of these top-heavy, post-colonial countries like ours, and then how it goes on the ground. And even with INGOs, I mean, if I may add, they also have, I mean, there are issues. I mean, even Médecins Sans Frontières, I mean, one of the sort of most sort of daring and neutral and non-weaponized, sort of non-securitized, I should say, NGOs on the ground, has also had race issues. Right. I mean, if you look at like the salaries and the decision-making around the world, you see that disparity. So even in NGOs, there have been issues of power and sort of these divides, right? Between not only the global South and North, but also within countries as well.
I think that a couple of these things that I want to sort of build on further. So the issue that you mentioned of institutional design, I think, is important. So how has aid been designed in these past few decades? What have been the mechanisms through which it is actually being delivered? And you've identified two things in particular. So the first is obviously the kind of contracting arrangements that are created. So, the bypassing of maybe state-sanctioned delivery architecture towards sort of more market-based sort of delivery, perhaps. And obviously the kind of contractors and aid organizations that are brought in for implementation. I think there is that part of the puzzle. And then the other part of the puzzle is the bureaucracies of post-colonial states themselves, right? And how they interact with aid. So, I mean, collectively, do you think this entire paradigm was even worth fixing in the first place, or do you think that this had sort of morphed or evolved into a particular form that we're probably better off without, to some extent?
I mean, I'm not going to, ruin the suspense of where our discussion is going. So I'll segment my response to your question. But I do. I mean, if we think about institutional design, I mean, and I have in my conversations where I've joked with colleagues, living around DC. So they call, the really big consulting firms which work like, corporate giants essentially for any other. It is just that their business is development. And they call the Beltway bandits.
Yeah.
Right. So they have been, they have mastered the art of like the log frame and all these technical instruments that are used by agencies like USAID. I mean, it's not to say that you don't need logic, intrinsic logic. You don't need a theory of change that you want to implement. And of course, you need to monitor and evaluate what's going on the ground. Otherwise, it can be, the money can be used to buy Rolexes.
Sure.
So that is all there. However, and if I stick to the American example, so USAID, I mean, in the Reagan years, where the idea of like, and this is where neoliberalism comes in, where the idea was of having lean and mean government. There were massive layoffs also in USAID at that time.
Right.
Which really hollowed it out, and it had very little capacity and personnel and, technical ability to monitor all this money that the US was throwing around the world. I mean, just a sliver of how much wealth it was accumulating, but nonetheless, I'm talking about billions and billions of dollars. And, one person, one manager, managing all these multiple projects. So they had to rely, and every country has its own sort of, context, its own abilities. So the lack of uniformity led to the creation of these, otherwise what can become very standardized, rigid tools as well for monitoring progress, for designing projects. So like the LFA, for instance, the log frame of analysis. And also, then you had the creation of these consulting firms that then just came in and provided this advice and became an intermediary between sort of, local partners and USAID. So this had led to a lot of this money being funneled through these private contractors, which had their own imperative of expediently spending funding and accounting and spending much more time on documentation than realizing what is available, or opportunities available on the ground and how to realize it sustainably. And I mean, there's been talk with Samantha Paz, I mean, who was... the Dems had appointed her, and she was a former American sort of ambassador to the UN. And she talked about localization of USAID, but, the baby got thrown out with the bathwater when USAID was dismantled. And a lot of the other, I mean, if we talk a little bit about AusAid or DFED, I mean, they also, and this has to do with deeper structural issues, because if you look at the kind of money that goes into poor countries and the kind of money that comes out of them, and this is historic, right? I mean, if you look at the extraction of labor, by which I mean slavery, right, and the extraction of, and this is Africa, of course, in the past few centuries, and then the extraction of capital, which continues. And one can argue, if you look at sort of debt bondage and you look at the kind of dismal kind of pay in the informal sector and its intersection with the global political economy to a certain degree, we still see that kind of brutal, ruthless exploitation at work. And if you look at the terms of trade, the lopsided terms of trade, we see that there is more money flowing out of, much more money flowing out of developing countries than the aid that is given to them.
Right. I think that I mean that's a very important point, and this is sort of a debate that often happens in academic circles on the scale of extraction, on whether we can put a number on it, and obviously that goes back to how we think about colonialism. But this particular point that you raised, which is of the structural subordination of many developing countries into what is essentially a dollar-based international system and the debt relations that come with it, I think that sometimes that's a conversation that happens often separately from the conversation on aid relations, right? Where developing countries are often just portrayed as recipients, but rather than being net contributors to the global economy. But there's another angle that's often introduced, or this is particularly true when we discuss this for the case of Pakistan, which is the role of geopolitics and development financing, right? And now Pakistan has had several periods in its history where its relationship with the US and sort of with the US-led global order has been one of alignment, and that has coincided with periods of relative plenty as far as development aid is concerned as well, right? Or at least that's the general sense that we get. So how do we understand this relationship? Is it just a very clear and categorical example of how aid as a political tool actually works? Does Pakistan provide you with a great case study on that front?
I mean, we wouldn't be the only ones saying it. I mean, you open the literature on international aid and you find, names of Pakistan and Egypt there as amongst the largest beneficiaries of this kind of aid. And then the ironies, right? I mean, the promotion of democracy. When do we get the most aid? Ayub Khan years, Ziaul Haq years, Musharraf years, coinciding with what's happening in Afghanistan, the earlier Sito-Cento pacts of the Cold War era, then Afghanistan twice over, right? I mean, we sort of, we realize, the irony in that. So essentially, that happens. But despite, the sort of the geostrategic element, I mean, to give you a more tangible example, so for instance, the devolution of power, right? I mean, it's been ironic that in Pakistan, the democratic governments haven't really ever bothered with devolving power down to the Union Council level and possibly even below. Right? The first time it happened was the Ayub Daur in the basic democracies era. Then you have the Zia days, and then the Musharraf, the LGO 2001, this kind of, yes, bypassing the parties, they were right to say that, this is an attempt to break our back, whatnot, and taking it directly to the people. So not only trying to get a semblance of legitimacy, but bypassing the existing political order, especially by holding them on a non-party basis. But then so much of the donor money had to be spent somewhere because the US and all these other countries were providing the money. And I remember for CEDA, I had gone to look at like best practices in devolution. And some of the stuff that was happening was very interesting. Right. So, I mean, there was GIS being used in Gujranwala for, sort of managing municipal services. At that time, it was being done by a retired major, of course, but elsewhere, I mean, there were real activation in Sindh of parent-teacher committees, went to KP, saw similar interesting innovations on the ground. But then when the money dries up for them, that's when it starts becoming a problem, because there were even then there was reluctance for allowing fiscal autonomy, for allowing, administrative autonomy. And then subsequently when the, sort of elections came back, we've come to a solution where they've again been choked. So real grassroots level democracy has been choked.
Of course.
But then again, just to reiterate, the broader irony was this was a country that, promotes democracy around the world, giving money to essentially, military governments to enable devolution. And then when democracy comes back for its own reasons, and MPA and M&A discretionary funds, and how they see local governments as competition, and the reluctance of chief ministers to devolve power, then creates a stumbling block that when you have democracy, development aid has also dried up, and we don't have local effective governance, till today.
Yeah, I think, that's a really stark example of how development aid, it's actually, when you were saying this, it reminded me of how ironic it is that a lot of the money for democracy promotion, especially at the local level, has happened under times of dictatorship in Pakistan, but it hasn't necessarily, touched on those bigger questions of constitutionalism, but rather it tends to take on this more sanitized way of looking at sort of local government as the appropriate forum for political participation in a country like Pakistan. But that gets thrown out every time sort of, we go through these political cycles. But I think that the Gujranwala example, I think I just want to sort of, take that forward, because those are some of the examples that we have where cuts to aid seem to have like a fairly clear negative impact on a range of different outcomes, right? So it could be community-based efforts of various types who suddenly see their funding dried up, but more in some ways, what's less visible and perhaps more detrimental in the long run is when we have cuts to knowledge production in various ways. So universities oftentimes have relied on development funding and development partners, think tanks in particular, who dealing with and sort of at least honestly taking up questions of Pakistan's development related issues. So with this current cycle of aid drying up, how do you see these institutions and these domains being impacted in the long run? And if you feel like this time around it's different, then one really has to start thinking about what does the future actually look like for knowledge production and for research and all of those associated ventures.
Latter part again, I'll park for now because you've already given me enough food for thought with the beginning of your question. So let me give you the example of health. I mean, and this has to, in some way, it speaks also to what is wrong with our, with our policy planning, right? And if we are unwilling to help ourselves, then we can't rely on the outside anymore, then what's going to happen?
Right.
So, I mean, things like disease surveillance, for instance, right? I mean, things like vaccination, immunization, that stitch in time that saves 9. Those are the kinds of issues that have been funded by donors. So not only the intellectual capital, tertiary education and elsewhere, we can talk about education as well, but that is what's taking the hit now. Right. Because, I mean, if you look at health budgets, I mean, they spent on salaries, they spent on building where there's contractors and, there's money made. So, the government, if it's not getting enough for disease surveillance and there comes around another pandemic, already we're seeing things like heat stress. I mean, we live in a city which has zero water waste management systems in place, right? So, I mean, we are already bearing the brunt of some of this. I mean, amongst the most polluted cities in the world. So, when that increasingly intersects with sort of health issues, I think it is going to compel, somehow or the other, we are going to have to come up with alternatives. And it's not to say that the geostrategic, larger position has also locked in. I mean, if God forbid, we actually see, a war break out over the Nile or the Chad, or there's another serious escalation here in the Indian subcontinent, more money will somehow or the other make its way, to address those types of problems. But I mean, rather than being reactive, I mean, even this year, everyone, health practitioners, analysts, were crying looking at the, if we look at the stunting, the malnutrition, but those are voiceless voices, right? I mean, but how far can we go? And I mean, after a while, it diminishes your capability to develop. I mean, we know that since, the 1990s, early 1990s, that lest you invest in human development, you don't get growth.
Right.
So we have to rethink health policy, education policy, and other policies. I mean, this is the time to do it, really.
Yeah. So I think, and that brings us to sort of, I guess, the I don't want to put a dollar value to this, but essentially the central question of how we can think about aid and sort of development in the current moment, which is what are the realistic sort of possibilities for alternatives. I mean, people often talk about local philanthropy. They talk about South-South cooperation, domestic resource mobilization, and I've done some of my own sort of research work with co-authors based at the International Center for Tax and Development, and we found that philanthropic giving in Pakistan just around zakat, totals almost about 700 billion rupees per annum, right? So that's not an insignificant amount, and in fact, our assessment was that this was about 3 times what official development assistance Pakistan had received, over the last 5 or so years, right? So there is clearly money that is being spent on local philanthropy, but is that a meaningful? Does that constitute a meaningful alternative? And if so, how can it be made more effective?
So certainly, I mean, expat earnings, the sort of the money that comes in from expats into Pakistan, and local philanthropy to a large degree, if you look at particularly conventional like Zakat and Baitul Mal, and you look at how well they are run, there's a lot to be said about that. So there's room for potential there. I mean, the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy and all for a while have been talking about this. And of course, then revenue collection, effective revenue collection. So those are 3 big things that can be sort of done domestically, if in the absence of aid, although aid itself is morphing. There is the NGOs are having their own rethink. The multilateral system has been having its own rethink also for a while. Wooing big business, for instance, which comes with its own baggage. And if you're thinking local philanthropy and big business, that has its own baggage too. Right. These are the kinds of issues that I think, and all of this is happening simultaneously. And there is certainly more room to make these kinds of issues more effective. I mean, in terms of target like identification of who is getting the benefits and how they are getting those benefits. I mean, basic things like the sustainability and capacity building issues around that, right? But there are also then impediments. I mean, there's the religio-political narrative that is also, I mean, not only operates at the local level, but also has political endorsement, right? And what that produces, and the ability to sort of harness, the be it the religious appeal for charity, be it sort of the idea of the nation using hardworking people's money that comes into the country. Of course, it goes to their families, but rather than building those like big houses, in Gujarat, which don't even have a little garden in them, right? I mean, how could that money be harnessed and will people want to trust? I mean, Kundi and Hawala were tightened because of international terrorism obligations, not because the government had won the trust of the people,
right?
Or offered them, adequate opportunities to harness that capital. So, there's a lot of room for rethink domestically, and let's see what happens internationally.
So while sort of that rethink is happening and sort of those are all interesting sort of conversations, there is still the ongoing issue of weakened state capacity, right? So there's one line of argument that suggests that foreign aid has played a significant part in weakening state capacity in countries like Pakistan, right? And there are multiple channels through which this has happened. One is by sort of outsourcing a lot of the policy thinking to aid organizations and consultants employed by aid organizations. Another channel that's not spoken of as much is aid organizations taking away high-performing bureaucrats and civil servants to work for them, essentially. And then a third would be bypassing state implementation mechanisms altogether and relying on community-based organizations or NGOs and so on. And that seems to have been the case on a number of different metrics. So health policies in one particular area. So the polio vaccination program, for example, we know donor involvement has been quite strong there, and that may have had implications for local state capacity and their efforts to deal with these issues. So does the current moment then offer us an opportunity to think about local state capacity? Or even if we were to, fill up the fiscal gap that departing aid has left, we'll still run into this hard challenge of how do we set up the mechanisms and how do we make a state accountable in its form that would actually be able to use and channel domestic resources for developmental purposes.
So, I mean, that's the real Herculean task, and I really wonder where that momentum is going to come from. It hasn't come from outside, and I suspect that it even won't come from the sort of top-down patronage mechanisms that are so entrenched now in the country and remain entrenched in existing development models. I mean, before I forget, I think one other way in which existing state capacity has been diminished is ironically using, first making an assertion that low-cost private education is much more effective and much better than what the state is providing. Right. And then at the same time, taking state resources, so not only having that narrative and let them play out in a level playing field, but, then using state resources. And here, think of the Punjab Education Foundation, the Sindh Education Foundation, which is essentially taking government money and giving it to the private sector, right, in the effort that they can reach the last mile. Right, so that further diminishes the capacity. So it's like the state axing its own foot, and this is happening with neoliberal ways of thinking, and not only happening in recipient countries, but also in donor countries as well. And that the charter schools in the US and
so third way developmentalism and PFIs in the UK and sort of community based organizations being given those mandates in the first place. So
and it's not to say that you don't. I mean, one is not averse to the idea, of course, of the Gramscian model of like civil society.
Sure.
But then a lot of this, when it is it's mushrooming, when there's aid, then in terms of level of commitment, in terms of sort of ideological positions, and in terms of how they interact with ground reality, can be very superficial and self-serving. Right. So, I mean, the project ends and end of story. So, while it would be great to have civil society, sort of bolstering the capability of the state, but really the bottom line is, the need for reflection within the state, within the international development architecture for development, to, stop trying to do business as usual. And my fear is that they are, rather than moving in the right direction, might be moving in a worse direction.
Right.
I mean, not that there won't be self-correctives there, and sophistication and other interventions like technology, etc. Like, now using AI, for instance. But the multilaterals have been wooing, for instance, the corporate sector. Shell and all these other companies, and there's a rationale for why you want to talk about the Better Cotton Initiative with Levi's. Right. Considering how much cotton they use. But then, the whitewashing, the greenwashing that can also occur, right? And it becomes very tricky the more aligned you are with and more dependent you are on the corporate sector, then really, one's paradigm changes. This is what had happened with the multilateral system when it talks about atrocity in the world, and NGOs sort of having become often sort of, have been so dependent on their donors that they are accused of being like Western agents, etc. Right? So this desperation that leads to being almost co-opted by these sort of powerful donors. So are we going to see less reliance by more astute states on that? Are we going to see South to South cooperation that is going to be better than what has been, coming our way from Western cooperation, technical cooperation, and financial cooperation?
Right.
Those are the big sort of, questions, unresolved questions, and I'm sure they'll produce all kinds of empirical evidence.
No, and I think it's in some ways, without rectifying or without at least thinking about how we deal with these questions domestically and what the state and the local state in particular is capable of. I don't think any sort of ideational and programmatic change in the nature of aid is going to be particularly effective unless those local delivery mechanisms and the state itself is made more accountable and more resilient. I mean, I keep thinking to the, as we're having this conversation, I keep thinking back to the fact that, some of the biggest efforts in poverty reduction, in the enhancement of human capital, in the enhancement of capabilities, and expansion of freedoms hasn't necessarily happened through aid programs. It's happened through effective state intervention, be it in China or in Latin America or in many other parts of the world. So I feel like there are lessons there, and and in some ways we're also in an exciting time. It's a troubling time because these essential services have been gutted with these aid cuts. But there's also something exciting about the fact that with an ideational paradigm moving towards this sort of a new world order or a post-Cold War, Cold War order of some sort, that opens up space, right, for thinking about cooperation across states, thinking about new patterns of doing development in particular. So what would be your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of this, that's the complexity of it, that all of this exists at the same time.
Right.
And they are, if you're looking at the evidence, you can find very robust data to back a lot of different types of assertions, in terms of what's going on. So all of these things are happening. There are also opportunities of cross-fertilization of ideas. So for instance, I just did something on the possibility of debt for nature swaps, which had, a model used by the US in South America in the 80s, and, thinking of maybe doing something with China that is similar, because China is also talking about greening BRI. Right? So, and what could be the feasible sort of ways in which that could happen, which is also of some benefit to China. Now, China also has geopolitical assertions. It has been using its own currency. So can we think of switching the currency in which those loans are being paid off, for instance? What are other ways that other countries of the global South can attract, like sort of Chinese investment, South to South investment, and what will come along with it. We've also seen accusations of debt diplomacy, and then how that is interacting with ground reality. So, are we just focusing on facilitating foreign investment, and the buck stops there? Or are we thinking, hey, what's happening in the artisanal mines where there's already restiveness? And, and then what the desire to, extract more, what is that going to do at the end of the day? Whose benefit is going to come out of that? Right. So these are the deeper, more challenging questions that we still have to deal with.
Right. Dr. Lee, thank you very much. I just have one last question. This is slightly sort of, it's not a digression, but it is more personal in nature. And so this entire conversation that we've had, one thing is quite clear, that a lot of the critical scholarship on the issue of development seems to have emerged from within the very institutions that have in some way or the other been either financed by these patterns of development or have been upheld by a particular type of global, political economic order. And I think both of us have been embedded in those institutions as occupationally, intellectually, over quite some time. So, on a personal note, how do you manage, this particular tension? How do you navigate this, what might be perceived as a contradiction of sorts, both personally and intellectually.
Well, as they say in Pakistan, ke tension lene ki nahi hai, dene ki hai. So, but it comes at a cost.
Right.
It comes at a personal cost of, seeing turbulence.
Right.
Experiencing turbulence. And I mean, if your analysis is abrasive, I mean that you have to sort of, then your opinions are sometimes not that wanted.
Sure.
So there's some of that, which one deals with. But at the end of the day, I mean, I say at least in my classrooms that, where you have the luxury at least and where you get the opportunity, be it working for an organization, who knows who lands up where,
Right.
With people from around the world and, coming from military to government to international donors. I mean, this is the fodder for the classes I'm teaching at present. And I say that at least like for now, let's try to let our guard down and sort of and wrangle with these issues. Because I mean, once you have personal insight and you can use these opportunities, these platforms to gain personal insight. But
Sure.
but there's at some point there are Faustian bargains that are made. So the longer you stay, the more of that way of being and doing becomes a part of you.
Sure.
So if but then you also, with your own insights, you have the opportunity of doing a better job. I mean, you can certainly be a better bureaucrat or better government official, a better manager in a NGO, a better officer in wherever.
Right.
So that is in the kinds of work one does, that is what one is striving for.
Right. Great. Dr. Thank you very much for a very illuminating conversation. And I hope you'll join us soon for the next iteration of Let's Talk Development.
Please subscribe so you never miss a podcast and comment below who you would like to see next.